I'm Toddleen Dafferlin, and thanks for watching this edition of Sun TV News. It was a very frustrating week for thousands of Turks and Caicos Islands residents who were seriously affected by disturbed weather that hit the islands. Phones were down, power was off, and there was flooding all across Providence Islands. It all started last Saturday, October 12, when the severe lightning struck a very important piece of equipment belonging to DIGICEL. Because of this, thousands of DIGICEL customers were unable to make calls or use their data services for a few hours. Of course, this was a major inconvenience to many DIGICEL users because, to make matters worse, calls were not possible between DIGICEL and Lime phones. Then on Tuesday, October 15th, there was another major setback when two generators from FORTIS failed. This caused serious disruptions all over Providence Islands, and some businesses was actually without power from 8 a.m. to as late as 11 p.m. on Tuesday. In a press conference on Wednesday, FORTIS CEO Mr. Eddington Powell apologized for the inconvenience and explained what led to the power outage. Mr. Powell explained that when the two engines failed, it was more difficult than if it had happened during a hurricane. In order to get to the bottom of these issues, Sun TV heard in great detail from FORTIS CEO Mr. Powell and Jay Saunders, the CEO of DIGICEL, about the disruption which their companies caused to residents. We hear first from Mr. Powell.
We have been facing a series of challenges in the aftermath of a couple of severe thunderstorms. The first was early Saturday morning and followed by another one on Monday morning. Unfortunately, as I was looking out the window, by the looks of things, we are not out of the woods yet in terms of what's happening on the weather front. Between 7:30 and 8:30 a.m. yesterday, we lost approximately 11 megawatts of capacity due to catastrophic failures of two engines. And this was in addition to the issues that we had on the transmission and distribution system, which began in the early morning of Saturday. And we worked throughout Saturday and Sunday to restore. We actually went into restoration mode and restored power to affected customers. These kinds of distribution problems are actually more difficult to solve than, for example, if you had a hurricane that blew down feeders. We know then we had to restore lines and lines of feeders. What we had here are problems in local areas that were affected by, say, blown transformers and lightning strikes and those kinds of things. So in terms of restoration, the restoration effort is actually more difficult because your resources are not concentrated. They are dispersed over wide areas of the service territory. So that took a very long time under very dangerous circumstances, and our linemen worked throughout the day on Saturday and Sunday to restore power. And then, of course, we know what happened again Monday. Monday morning, we had another lightning storm which affected the system again. And this was then compounded by the unfortunate loss of two engines on Monday morning, in which we lost approximately 11 megawatts of capacity. Again, this happened at a time when we had 15 megawatts of capacity down for forced and unforced maintenance. That is, maintenance due to failures as well as planned maintenance. And in the power business, this is what happens. You don't know what to expect. Where you have, for example, on high-speed engines with a lot of moving parts, as we have in our diesel engines, these kind of failures can happen at any time. And unfortunately, it could not have been at the worst time for these kinds of failures. Those two failures that happened. Our dedicated linemen and plant personnel worked tirelessly around the clock, literally.
Powell noted that if this had happened a few years ago, the effects would have been much worse and the entire FORTIS plant would have been lost. This would have crippled the islands of Providence Islands.
And I would very much like to publicly acknowledge their tremendous service to the company and indeed to the country. I'm absolutely convinced that in most parts of even the developed world, the restoration of this nature would have taken days, if not weeks. It's a credit to the quality of our people and to our investment that the company has made in generation, transmission, and distribution, and protection systems, because we did not lose the entire plant. If this had happened 2, 3 years ago, I assure you, without the protection systems that we now have in place, that we have put in place, our PLC systems and protection systems, we would have lost the entire plant yesterday, and perhaps even as early as Saturday morning with the strikes on the system. So it's a credit to our investment that we did not lose the entire plant. I was able to restore service in fairly decent time, considering the circumstances. I would like to apologize to our customers that were affected and for any inconvenience, and to thank you for your patience. And with that, we'll take some questions.
He explained that of all the islands served by FORTIS, only Provo was affected.
Based only in Provo. In fact, we of course checked with Grand Turk and South Caicos and Salt Key and North and Middle, and very fortunately, they did not suffer any of the, to the extent of the problems from the T&D system from the lightning storm that Provo suffered. What happened, fortunately, that apparently the storm was more west than it was east, so Grand Turk was not affected. Saturday morning when I spoke to the people in Grand Turk, our team in Grand Turk, they were reporting that they had no problems. And North and Middle Caicos were not affected, and also North and Middle Caicos were not affected by the generation issues, because we do have sufficient standby on North and Middle that we were able to put them immediately on standby. In fact, they were back feeding across the Keys, that some of our customers on the Keys coming back towards Provincialis were actually on their standby power that was not only providing North and Middle with power, but were actually feeding back towards Provo as well. So the problems both from generation and from the lightning storm was concentrated in Provo, was only affected by in Provo.
This was the first time in many years that FORTIS had such a comprehensive press conference. The FORTIS CEO took the opportunity to go into details about which areas were affected. He stressed that these things happened all over the world. However, he could not say how much money it cost the company.
There were a handful of large commercial customers who were still on their standby, and we work, and that's another thing I'd like to just digress briefly to say that we were able to work very closely with all our large commercial customers, and we would say to them, can you go on your own standby if you have standby power available? And I can start naming some of them, but I don't think that is appropriate. But they were able to go on their standby, and for a few of them, they were able to remain for about 12 hours or so on their own standby power. So at 8 o'clock yesterday, we were able to restore power to all of our residential powers, our customers. And as I speak to you now, we have power available to all our customers, all 12,000 of all 9,000 or so of our customers here in Provincialis. This started on Saturday morning, so it was the outage was very much localized. But we had 3 feeders that were affected by the generation. 1, 2 in the leeward area, and 1 going towards downtown and Airport Road, and I believe some of Blue Hills were affected, and Q-Town were affected by those 2 feeders. So of the 9,000 or so customers on Provincialis, I would say about 22, just over 2,200 customers at the height of the problems were affected by the outage, about 2,200. It's very difficult for me to speculate. We are still making assessment. Our guys, I mean, I have tremendous respect for our personnel. I was over the plant yesterday and saw them working under very difficult circumstances, trying very hard to get the power back on. But we are not in a position yet where we can make the assessment. It is unfortunately these things happen, but it happens to all power systems all over the world, particular developed world. And we have protection and safeguards to ensure that these things doesn't happen. But there's no electricity system in this world. In this world, there's 100% immune from these kinds of lightning storms and those kinds of things. And then, of course, on the generation side, failure can happen at any time to high-speed generation engines. It's part of the fact of life in the utility business. We will make that assessment over the next few days, but to be honest, we have been focused on trying to restore power and trying to get our customers back on.
Powell said FORTIS workmen figured that they could have made the repair in a shorter period, but as they were fixing the problems, they realized that the situation was much more serious than they first thought.
But what happened yesterday really was outage by creep. So it started at about 8:30 yesterday when we lost generation. And then our initial assessment was that we'd be on in 2 hours, so we'd be on by 10, then we'd be on by 12. And as the mechanics and other personnel really, pulled the engines down and started to investigate it, they found even more problems and more failures. And these are very technical aspects. When you're talking about repairing and replacing turbochargers and all that on these engines, it really very technical work. So it went on when we thought we would have restored power by midday. Then we thought we would restore power by 4 o'clock and by 6 o'clock. And unfortunately, as I said, we didn't get to restore power until 8 o'clock. But it was not for the want of effort on the part of our personnel. They really worked. So really some customers were off for from 8 until in the morning, 8:30 in the morning until 8 at night. So that's what 12 hours or so. And usually we would rotate the customers, but the way this happened, it wasn't like it was a hurricane or anything like that. It just happened. We thought we could restore power a lot quicker, and then we actually did. So we didn't start to rotate the customers. Then we realized that, well, we should rotate our customers. They're just too late then. Then more customers were just been off as we switch and rotate the T&D system and system. So unfortunately, some customers were off for about 12 hours.
Despite the major setback on Tuesday, Mr. Powell said that Turks and Caicos Island still has one of the most reliable electricity systems in the world.
We understand the impact and the importance of electricity to the economy. We understand that. That's why we are very proud of our reliable record. We have 99.9% RC reliability. That is on par and above par with most countries in this world. I think the Turks and Caicos, we can go for literally months, the Turks and Caicos without any outages. And we're very proud of that. We work very hard at that. But this happens. This is not a plug-and-play system. Electricity systems are very complicated system and can be disrupted very, very, very easily.
He said that having cables underground would not have made much of a difference because of the heavy flooding that occurred over the past few days. He noted, for example, that the flooding was so serious that his company had a tank that caught more than 1 million gallons of water.
I'll tell you what, there's always has been the somewhat controversy over overhead lines versus underground line. What we found in this storm, and people think that underground line is better and safer than overhead line, we found that the flooding, which the amount of water that was dumped, our records has about 7 inches of water fall in a very short period of time, and we had a tank that caught 1.1 million gallons of water. So we know how much water fell. That the underground infrastructure was flooded. So you had switch gears and switches and stuff underwater. So yes, underground, it is protected from wind, but then when you have flooding, it's susceptible to flooding. This is the, what electricity systems have to put up with. And we'll look at what we can do. We'll look at how, we schedule our maintenance. But what can you do if you have a failure? What can you do if an engine broke, a part of the engine broke? Not much you can do, but try to replace it. And we, fortunately, again, because of the way we operate, we actually had those spares on site in our warehouse. And these are not cheap spares. These are very expensive spares, but we carry them anyway. Again, we're able to source the spares that we had on site. I was able to effect the repairs and the restoration very quickly. But what can we do? We are looking constantly on how we design the system and the protections that we put in the system. We are putting a lot into the system. I didn't mention that. Had this happened 2 and 3 years ago, we would have lost the entire plant. Absolute no question about that. Given the proximity of the T&D faults that we had, and then given what happened, the catastrophic loss of those 2 engines, which was about 12 megawatts. At the time, given our peak load, that was a significant portion of our peak load at the time. So we would have lost the plant. But because of the protection system we have implemented, we didn't lose the plant. So we are constantly looking at how we can operate better, how we can protect ourselves in these circumstances, how we can restore better, how we can dispatch our resources and do it better. We're looking at such things as, we have a great mapping system now that tells us where all of our assets are in the field. And we're looking at how better we can use that to identify where our assets are in the field. We're looking at a smart grid system. In the earlier stages of us developing a smart grid system, smart metering, again, will help us dispatch and resources better and more targeted. So we're doing all of these things, but some of these things are very expensive and they take a long time to implement. But we're constantly working at it,
This is Sun TV, real news as it happens. We'll be right back.
Life moves fast. It's extraordinary what you can see when you take a second look. Capture the extraordinary around you with DIGICEL's 4G mobile internet. Share the moment instantly with our superfast speeds on your mobile device. The internet as it was meant to be. Only with DIGICEL 4G. DIGICEL. Be extraordinary.
Welcome back to Sun TV News. As we said at the top of our newscast, DIGICEL customers were also without service for several hours on Saturday. DIGICEL CEO Jay Saunders explains what caused the problem and what was done to fix it.
Early hours of Saturday morning and starting late Friday night, there was a fierce thunderstorm, primarily over Providenciales. It seemed to have been very bad over the Grace Bay area. But that lightning from that thunderstorm damaged about $50,000 to $60,000 worth of our core equipment. And when we say core equipment, we mean equipment that manages the network and keeps the network upright. And because of a few critical pieces of equipment got damaged, the network went offline. And the team got on site at 5 a.m. on Saturday morning and worked throughout the morning and through the early afternoon to restore the system. We got most of the system back up by Saturday afternoon and the remaining portion of it by Sunday morning. But it was because the lightning damaged a number of critical pieces of equipment, and we were able to replace that equipment. We flew some people in on Monday night, on Saturday night, and they did an assessment, and right now we're putting in a redundancy so that will allow us to avoid that type of issue in the immediate future. And then we have plans for the long-term future to harden the site to ensure that it doesn't happen going forward. The system is stable, but it's not at this state where we'd like for it to be in terms of protection. But in terms of service levels, it's back to 100%. But I feel that there's still some parts that are vulnerable to the weather conditions we're going through. But we're doing our best to ensure that it doesn't bring the network down again. And then once we're out of this and get into the next financial year, we'll put a shelter up, a proper building up to ensure that the equipment's protected. Well, what happened is that when we built out our equipment, we put a lot of things in trailers. And so if you go up to our switch site, you would see that our switch site consists of multiple trailers with very high-end multi-million-dollar equipment in those trailers. And those trailers are connected by cables that are running in pipes between them. What we would ideally like to get is that equipment inside of a building, a proper building. So you'd build a structure, and then that equipment that's actually in trailers would then be protected inside buildings. Now, the cables connecting between the equipment are actually exposed. So we've put in some temporary measures to protect those cables connecting the equipment now. But the proper thing you'd want is a structure, and we wouldn't be putting in a structure until about April of next year.
Saunders also explains why there was no connection between Lime and Digicel phones.
There's something called an interconnection between the networks that allows our customers to call each other. And and part of the equipment that got damaged was the interconnection equipment that ties our network together. And so what they were saying to their customers is that if you can't get through the Digicel customers, the problem resides on the Digicel side. But there is two pieces of equipment that ties our network to Lime, and then the same thing with IslandCom to Lime. So if you want to call an IslandCom customer, it goes through the interconnection that's actually at Lime. Lime was the midway point, because when we first launched, everyone interconnected with Lime. And because that piece of equipment got damaged also, customers between our networks couldn't call each other. What happened is that when we built out our equipment, we put a lot of things in trailers. And so if you go up to our switch site, you would see that our switch site consists of multiple trailers with very high-end multi-million-dollar equipment in those trailers. And those trailers are connected by cables that are running in pipes between them. What we would ideally like to get is that equipment inside of a building, a proper building. So you'd build a structure, and then that equipment that's actually in trailers would then be protected inside buildings. Now, the cables connecting between the equipment are actually exposed. So we've put in some temporary measures to protect those cables connecting the equipment now. But the proper thing you'd want is a structure, and we wouldn't be putting in a structure until about April of next year.
Well, that's our Sun TV News Brief for today. Join us again tomorrow when we bring you real news as it happens directly to your computer, mobile device, or smartphone. If you know anyone traveling overseas who would like to keep up with what is happening in the Turks and Caicos Islands, get them to email us at sun@suntci.com so we can add them to our mailing list to get Sun TV News. Thanks for watching. I'm Darlene Dafferlin.